to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast with financial planner and retirement specialist Dan Haylett. In this podcast, Dan explores ways to help you overcome the behavioural, emotional and financial challenges of life after work. Join Dan for the journey where he will explore how our wonderful human brain will naturally fight against what it takes to live a happy, healthy and wealthy retirement. Dan will draw on years of expertise, experience and expert guests to solve the behavioural, emotional and financial challenges of life after work. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast. I'm your host, Dan Haylett, and today I am super excited to be joined on the show by a man of many talents. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's a clinical psychologist, a behavioural finance expert, the host of a wonderful podcast, currently the Chief Behaviour Officer at Orion Advisor Solutions, a St. Louis Cardinals baseball fan, I think your Diet Coke's #1 brand ambassador, and Elon Musk's Twitter friend. So, Dr. Daniel Crosby, welcome to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast.
Dan, very good to be here.
Great to have you. And I know there was a kind of a long introduction. You do a number of things. You're a real industry legend and heavyweight. Your books are amazing. And I'd love for you just to share a little bit with the listeners the journey that you've taken from the couch in your clinical days through to where you sit now, really looking at money life. I'd love for you to share that journey.
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm actually trained as a clinical psychologist, but a couple of years into my doctoral training, I really just started to burn out, candidly. I think I probably had pretty poor boundaries, but between me and my clients, I was taking my work home, and it was just enormously stressful work. It's important work, it's amazing work, but it's tough work to sit in counsel with someone who's having, in many cases, the worst week of their life, 40 or 50 times a week. And so I really just started to burn out, but I knew that I still had this deep and abiding passion for psychology. I knew I wanted to study why humans did the things that they did, the things that made humans tick. And so, I was all of 23 years old when I started my PhD program. So I went to my father, who is a financial advisor. And, I said to him, look, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I want to do something with psychology, but it's not this. And he said, well, why don't you look into my work? Because he said, there's a ton of psychology in the work that I do. Now, at the time, at 25 years of age, I had never viewed my dad in that light. To me, he was a numbers guy. Like, he was, some mix of a salesperson and an asset allocator. Like, that's really what he did. Was he managed money for people and he brought in assets. And I had never sort of supposed that there was a psychological angle to the work that he did. But that simple suggestion by my dad really put me on a path to explore financial psychology, behavioral economics, behavioral finance. And long story short, I discovered this world. My dad 20 years ago didn't have the language to say, like, hey, you should look into behavioral finance. He didn't know what that was. He just knew that he relied on psychology in his work. And so that simple suggestion by him put me on a path to try and become an intermediary between the ivory tower of academia and people like my dad, people like you, who are the advisors in the trenches every day, serving good people who treat their work like a calling. So I've tried to be a translator between academicians that are much smarter than me, and then the advisors who are working with clients every day.
And I think that work that you've done, Daniel, is I want to say off the bat that the books that you've written have had such a material impact on my career. So I want to thank you for kind of that journey and getting to a point where you've written, I think, 2 wonderful books, The Laws of Wealth and The Behavioral Investor, which links to those books will be in the show notes. But, I think it's not just for people like me, as you said, it's the getting this behavioral investment theory and philosophy and understanding people's emotions and behaviors out into the wider world. And you've done some amazing work on that. And the work through your writing and your podcast and your speaking is helping people across the world be better at that intersection of the mind and the markets, which is something that I'd love to kind of talk to you about today, specifically around retirement, because I think it is probably one of the most emotive subjects that there are. It's one of life's biggest transitions, and there's so much more at stake than numbers when it comes to this transition, I think, from the work that I do. So I'm just curious, what do you believe is kind of one of the main challenges of this wonderful modern day made up thing that we now call retirement?
Yeah, it's the right question to be asking from a psychological standpoint, because I think there's been so much fixation on the number, right? Like making sure you reach that number. But the psychological complexity of something that you rightly note is made up in sort of a modern institution, the psychological complexity that attends retirement is really, really, really intense. And so if I think about the most important thing to do with retirement, I think it's people's lack of psychological preparedness. Viktor Frankl, who's sort of a professional hero of mine, he has this quote that says, ever more people have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. And we see that a lot in retirement. We see a lot of times in retirement that people have fastidiously prepared for the financial aspects of their retirement to make sure that their financial house is in order. But work, traditional work, when we look at sort of the 5 things, and we could talk about them if you'd like, but if you look at sort of the 5 things that make people happy and make people whole, work touches about 4 of these. And so losing that structure, losing those relationships and that purpose and that meaning and that being a part of a team and striving for something bigger than yourself takes a psychological toll on us. And so while we are free in new and important ways, and that can be a positive thing, so much of sort of the psychological scaffolding of our lives fall away. So I think, like Frankl said, we not only need to prepare to have the means to retire, we need to prepare to have a meaning to retire too.
I think it's such an important framework that we work with. I mean, I think too many people focus on the retire to, focus on the retire from and not the retire to. Mm-hmm. As you said, work provides so much more to people than money. And I think there's a lack of preparation around that. And the best retirements that I see are the ones that are best prepared for in advance about what they're going to. What does life look like beyond actual paid work? And often we're retiring from a salary, but we're not retiring from life.
I think what you said is just now is brilliant, because one of the, the further psychological complexities and reason why people don't prepare is that retirement, as much as we may want certain elements of it, is seen as a sort of death. And we know that people have a hard time talking about finality and loss and transition and change. And that's what retirement is. So I think a lot of times, the idea of retirement comes along with this idea of sort of personal obsolescence or losing who we are. I had a friend, sort of a mentor quite a bit older than me, who sold a business, exited a business for an extraordinary sum of money, had money to last multiple lifetimes, but retired from this work that he had done for a very long time in this business that he had built. And he found that he was just treated so differently in retirement. He had these cards made up that had his name on them, and it said former person underneath it. Former person. Like, think about this. Like, he had lost his identity because his identity had been so wrapped up in the important and highly compensated work he had spent a lifetime doing. So I think to avoid becoming former people, we have to figure out, as you've noted, what we're retiring to.
And I have conversations with people all the time about that conversation you have at a barbecue, you've turned up, your friends and family are there, there's people that you don't know, and someone comes over to you while you've got your hot dog and they say to you, they're having a conversation, what's the one thing they're going to ask you within the first 10, 15 seconds? It's going to be kind of, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, working on the answer to that question is really important. Creating a retirement business card that has a purpose attached to it, whether you're a gardener, a driver, an aspiring golf professional, whatever you want to be. I think grabbing an identity or multiple identities is really, really important. So, Daniel, I'd love to touch on some of the stuff that you talk about in your books. Now, both The Laws of Wealth and The Behavioral Investor are focused on investing and all of the wonderful behaviors that we exhibit when we're investing our hard-earned money. When it comes to retirement, I'm kind of curious about this. Do you think that we often forget about what made successful investing over a 20, 30-year career? Do we often forget about that when we get into retirement?
I think we do, because in most cases, there's not, more money coming in. We're now living on a fixed income. And so sort of mentally, our tendency to be loss averse or more risk averse or more fearful can be amplified if we're not careful. The other thing is that I think a lot of people misunderstand longevity risk, right? I think most people understand, if we treat retirement, let's say 65, right, sort of a typical retirement, if someone steps away from work at 65, I mean, there's a very good chance that they could live 30, 35 years more. That's multiple market cycles. That's many, many opportunities for your wealth to compound. And so, I have 3 young children. Well, two of them are still pretty young. One of them's growing up pretty fast. But, I have children. And when my youngest was born, they said, there's about a 40% chance that she will live to be over 100. And that's incredible to think about, that as healthcare gets better and better, as modern medicine continues to improve, we are going to have to prepare for retirements that are incredibly lengthy. And I think that a lot of people say, well, I'm on a fixed income now. I'm on, I got to kind of constrain my risk taking and things like that. Well, you've got potentially an entire lifetime spreading out in front of you. And you may want to think twice about that, because in many cases, our retirement will be every bit as long as our actual working life.
And I think that presents challenges about trying to put ourselves in a future state as well, doesn't it? I think there's, when we try and fast forward and we think, actually, what will life, if I'm going at age 60 or 65 and I'm stepping back from work, what will life look like in 10, 15, 20 years' time? And I think people struggle to transport themselves to recognize that it's going to be materially different in 20 years' time than what it is now. But I think there's the ability to do that or see that is crucial in understanding how we can, how things will change and what we need to do going forward.
Yeah, you and I were talking before we hit record about this concept that you're talking about, which psychologists refer to as the end of history illusion, right? This idea that whoever I am today is sort of the permanent, unchanging, fully baked version of myself. But, if I look back on myself, and I'm sure, you're nodding your head, I'm sure you're the same way. If I look back at my mindset and my decision-making and my, my values and my preferences from 10 or, God forbid, 20 years ago, a lot has changed. And so, the 43-year-old Daniel that sits in front of you today, yeah, there will be some features that are consistent with the 53, 63, and 73-year-old version of myself. But I think we need to be flexible and to know that priorities and realities can change, and understand that this isn't the end of history, and that the way that you are today is not necessarily the way that you'll always be, and build enough flex into that financial plan that you're able to pivot with what are the inevitable changes that will occur in your life, which is a good thing, right? We should be excited about continued growth well into our retirement years.
What do you think is the impact on our minds when, I think if we're at work, potentially we adapt to change better, because there is, there's a consistency and somewhat of a understanding what the future might hold. But when we go into retirement, there's huge amounts of uncertainty at play. So that must have a massive impact on how we deal with what that future looks like.
Yeah, so I'll share an example I came across recently. It was actually an example in England, right? So during World War II, there were all these bombings, right? So London was bombed very consistently, like almost every night London was bombed. And then sort of out in the outlying suburbs and exurbs, there was bombing as well, but it was far more sporadic, right? I think it was every 8 to 10 days versus every night. And so after the horrors of war were over, so the psychologists are in there trying to put the pieces back together, and they're working with people. And what they found was really surprising to them, because they found that the places where the shelling was the worst were actually far better off, right? The people in London were far better off psychologically in terms of their levels of stress and anxiety than the people in the suburbs and the exurbs. And the reason has everything to do with predictability, right? So the nightly bombings in London were awful, right? I mean, just absolutely catastrophic. They're horrible. But you could bank on them, right? And, likewise, there's a lot to dislike about, I'm not drawing a straight line between the atrocities of war and work life, but, likewise in our work life, there's certainly things we don't like, right? There's certainly things we don't like, and there's some things we would change, but at least you know what you're going to get. And retirement is a little bit of a blank slate. And with that blank slate can come stress, anxiety, and all the things that they observed in the study I'm talking about. So I think it's, we're on a bit of a theme here about sort of putting some structure and some purpose and sort of a psychological scaffolding around this time to help it be just a little bit more structured and a little bit more predictable.
Because I think you mention it in your books a lot about emotionally driven decisions kind of lead to poor outcomes. I think, that structure, it enables us to take those kind of highly charged emotional decisions, which I'm presuming are going to be more heightened in a world of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, uncertainty absolutely heightens emotion, and heightened emotions tend to lead to poor financial decisions. There's research in the laws of wealth that I cited that looked at people who were experiencing heightened levels of emotion and found that they had a 13% loss in cognitive processing power. They basically were 13% stupider, like to put it in sort of layperson's terms. And so, anytime we can sort of keep our emotions in check or set some kind of structure in place that helps to have that happen, we're going to be a lot better off.
And I think that brings us nicely onto a framework that you've got, which I think, when it comes to structure and investing money, we're going to go into a period of heightened uncertainty, heightened emotion, which can potentially lead to poorer outcomes, making decisions that put our happiness and our retirement in jeopardy. I've seen it and prevented it on a few occasions, thankfully. But so, kind of having rules around investing from a behavioural point of view, and you've got a great framework, the 4 C's of rule-based behavioural investing. I'd love to touch on them if that's okay with you. So I think, looking at number 1 in that is the consistency rule. So, why is it important to have consistency in your in a rules-based investing strategy?
Yeah, so consistency is really a rule about rules. And so what's been done, and one of the things that I cited, one of the things I cited in the book was what's called a meta-analysis. So it's basically a study of all the studies that compared human level, human discretion, right? Sort of personal, emotionally led decision making versus following simple rules or processes. And in many cases, this is like PhD level discretion. It looked at things like here in the US, we have a giant problem with overpopulation in prisons. 1% of Americans are in jail at any given time. And so we're always trying to decide, who stays and who goes, who's been rehabilitated. And they would do things like convene a body of doctors like myself, like get a bunch of psychologists in the room, look deep in the eyes of the person and see if they're sort of repentant and, ready to be set back on the street. And they compared this to things like looking at two decision points. In this one study, the decision points were, what were they in jail for, right? So what was their sort of offense? And then how did they act in jail? So don't ask them, if they found God. Don't ask them if they're going to be nice when they get out. Just look at their behavior. And they found that there was about a 4x increase in the efficacy of just following simple rules. But we find that everywhere. We find that well over 90% of the time that following simple rules beats following your gut. And we find that in medical settings, financial settings, judicial settings, criminological settings, over 200 studies in this meta-analysis that I cited in the book. So that first C is really a rule about having rules. As you enter retirement, what are the rules of engagement, right? And wherever possible, automate them, right? My money gets taken out of my bank account every 2 weeks. I don't have to be a great saver every 2 weeks. I had to be a great saver once, right? I had to make a good decision once. If I could do the same thing with eating, I'd be a male model, right? I could just lock in hey, eat an appropriate amount of protein, fruits, and veggies for the rest of your life and just lock it in. I'd be in great shape. Why am I not in great shape? Because 3 times a day, I have to contend with should I eat a donut or should I eat a salad? But with our finances, we can do something different. We can lock it in once, automate it, and let those rules take care of themselves. That's the consistency piece.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm very donut heavy at the moment, so I need to get back on the salads.
They're very good.
Yeah, absolutely. Too good to turn away. So I think when we enter, investing in general is a complex thing, and we make it complex, and it is emotional, and we get invested in our investments, if that makes sense. So when we're confronted with those complex decisions, particularly in retirement, when there's probably more at stake about spending our money on what makes us happy and what we're doing, your second of the 4 C's is clarity. And I think that's so important when it comes to your money.
Yeah. So one of the things that I talk about in my books is, something that I call Wall Street bizarro world, which is how sort of the rules of good financial decision making are 180 degrees of what we would expect them to be sometimes. And so if you look at something like making great investment decisions, a lot of people assume that since financial markets are complex dynamic systems, that they need to be met at a similar level of complexity. And what we find is quite the opposite. That complex dynamic systems like a financial market actually need massive simplicity if they are to be mastered. And so simple rules like controlling your fees are huge. In fact, Morningstar did research a few years back that looked at the best predictors of fund performance. The number one predictor of fund performance was fees. And so, things like just making sure you're paying a fair price for the advice you're getting, making sure you're paying a fair price for the products you're using is massively beneficial versus something like, is this an AI generated fund or something like that? So just really, really simple things like, am I paying an appropriate fee? Am I appropriately diversified? Am I seeking outside help, counsel from an advisor? Just a handful of things. Am I investing in a way that is empirically valid, right? That's evidence-based. 4 or 5 simple little considerations, you'll beat 95% of the professional investors if you've just locked in on just a couple simple little rules.
And there was revelation in those chapters in both your books for me, and I think the evidence is so in favor of that it's almost impossible to ignore or go against now. So I think having that locked in and understanding into retirement is so important. I think that brings us on to the next thing, because I think, again, you mentioned you try and meet a complex world with a complex solution, but quite often the best thing to do is nothing, right? So you see these scenarios play out. Quite often, it is a decision. You make a decision to do nothing, but it feels very strange. And I think your third C is courageousness, and you have to be quite courageous in retirement, don't you, when it comes to the money and the decisions that you make?
Yeah, perhaps more courageous than you've been at any other part of your investing journey, for some of the reasons that we've talked about, that you don't, now when I'm working, if my account goes down a bit, no big deal. I'm sort of continuing to stoke that fire with new money. It's a different animal in retirement. So yeah, that courage is more warranted than ever. But, like you said, the courage that I'm talking about is usually the courage to do nothing. And a lot of times, we think about a courageous act as being heroic. But, enter Wall Street bizarro world again. We know that a vast majority of the gains in financial markets occur a small minority of the time. By some estimates, it's about 80% of the gains in the market occur about 10% of the time. So it becomes very difficult to gauge if this is a good 10% or a bad 10%. You've really just got to stick around. And so William Sharpe, who won a Nobel Prize for his work into this, found that you had to get your buy and sell decisions right 82% of the time to match doing nothing, right? So you could do nothing, or you could be right nearly almost always, which PS you're not going to be. And and you get the same outcome. And the final thing that I'll say, Dan, is Meyer, Statman, and others have studied this now in 19 different countries. In 19 different countries, they've looked at activity levels in financial markets. Basically, how much is someone trading? How much are they poking and readjusting their portfolio? And they found that the less people do, the better they do. And in every single country where it's been studied, the less active people are, the higher their returns. So courage is not running through a burning building. It's not doing some great heroic act. When it comes to financial markets, courage is typically just hanging out, focusing on something else, keeping your mind off it so that you have the courage to stick it through to a brighter day.
And I think that it comes to the point of the fourth C as well, isn't it? It's having conviction in your conviction in that process, conviction in your plan, conviction in the process, and that that conviction, I think, has to be one where you control the controllables, right? You have to. The stress of trying to control a portfolio can lead to so much anxiety, but you need to have conviction in your thoughts to control what's in front of you and control life. Is that fair?
Yeah. So a friend of mine, another Dan, a third Dan, if you will, a friend of mine called Dan Egan wrote a piece that I wish I had written, and it talks about the need for investors to have a faith. like almost a religion, right? It doesn't much matter what it is, right? It could be, broad diversification, index funds, growth investing, value investing. It could be 100 things, but he basically says you need to believe in your process. You need to know what you own and why you own it. You need to believe in your process and have faith in whatever your chosen process is, faith that is deep enough and significant enough that it can see you through the hard times, because every single style of investing will fall in and out of favor at various times. There's many evidence-based, intelligent ways to invest. All of them go out of favor between 30 and 50% of the time. And so when it's your time, you have to say, nope, I know what I'm doing. I'm an internationally diversified investor, right? I have about half of my stock allocation to international holdings. For the last 10 years, that's been a dumb move, right? Like I should have, quote, air quote, I would have had higher returns if I had remained invested only in the US. But as I talk about in my books, like you can get the right result for the wrong reason. I think the actual language in my book is you can be right and still be a moron, right? Not quite as diplomatic.
I love that line. That's
So like, look, me remaining diversified across geographies is a good practice, whether or not it goes my way. The same way that you purchasing a car with an airbag is a good practice, whether or not you get in a wreck, right? Like if you drive a car for 10 years with an airbag, and you never get in a wreck, you don't go, oh God, like why did I pay for that airbag? Like total waste of money, right? It's still smart. And so we have to have conviction in our process and stick with it in good times and bad.
I think it's so important for listeners to rewind on that because I think it's very easy to get distracted in a very noisy world now. If you've got more time on your side, you're probably going to be more interested in those things. And I think to have someone walk alongside you is really important. Someone that has some, that's not you. That's why we hire personal trainers, and that's why they're not us, and they have an ability to hold us accountable. But I think it's so important to have those 4 C's, not just from an investment point of view, but I think they stand really strong if we kind of say from a life point of view in retirement as well.
Yeah.
I want to quote you in one of your books because I think there's a search for kind of what wealth means to people. But in one of your books, you kind of say, and this is in Laws of Wealth, integrating psychology and finance provides for the possibility of increasing both our returns and our awareness of self. Therein lies true wealth. I think we're searching for true wealth a lot of times. And I think, I'd love to get your take on, how can we equip ourselves better to be in an environment that gives us more time to discover what true wealth means to us?
Yeah, so I think we need to use money for what it's good for and let it stop there. So what do I mean by that? Right? When we look at the research around what money does well and what it does poorly, one of the things that it does really well is it makes us not miserable, right? So, having insufficient money is miserable, right? Because you can't feed yourself, you can't clothe your children, you can't, put a roof over your head. There's no denying, right, that up to a certain income level, money does buy happiness because it buys freedom from a certain type of worry. But what we see is that very dramatically past that point, that money's ability to improve our lives greatly plateaus, right? Psychologists call this a hygiene factor, right? I mean, think about other types of hygiene, brushing your teeth or something, right? Brushing your teeth doesn't make you ecstatic, but like if you don't brush your teeth for a week or two, you're going to be very miserable, right? You're gonna have some problems if you don't do it, but having it doesn't put you on cloud 9. So
I don't think you're going to have many friends as well, are you?
Right. You're not gonna have too many dates either. Big problem there.
No.
But so, use money to take away, sort of that worst case scenario, take misery off the table. And then past that point, we see that money's good for a couple of things. We see that money is good when it gets us out of things we hate. Like I hate physical labor. I have a big yard. I do not like to work in my yard. I have paid someone to cut my yard for a very long time. May it ever be so, right? It makes me really happy that in this hot Atlanta weather, I don't have to get out and cut my yard. So like buying our way out of doing things that we hate or that take a lot of time brings us happiness. Buying new experiences with people we love buys us a lot of happiness, right? Taking that trip. I took my daughter to France and England right before COVID, and it was an absolutely unforgettable trip. And I'm going to take my son to Japan next year. It's going to be unforgettable, right? Like these sorts of things, money helps because it introduces novelty into our lives and it gives us new experiences. And then the last one is giving money away. Giving money away has been shown to buy a great deal of happiness. Being charitably inclined, putting some good out in the world, helping your fellow man or woman. This is a powerful way that money buys happiness. Beyond that, though, the other things you want to do in your life, if it's not one of those things, money doesn't help. So get enough money to take misery off the table, spend the money that you do have in ways that are fulfilling and enriching. And then beyond that, it's about you doing the work. It's about you surrounding yourself with the right people. It's about you getting that right mindset. And those are going to be the two biggest predictors of your happiness once you've done with money what money can do.
Fantastic. Giving away is really interesting for me. I use the phrase a lot with clients that I think deep down we'd all rather give our money away with a warm heart rather than a cold hand. And I think, that the ability to see our money impacting the people that we love in a way that brings them joy. All the studies, as you've said, give us, show that gives us massive satisfaction. And this myth around, I'll just wait till the end of life and I'll leave it to them on my deathbed. If there's one thing I could get away from for people is that I think it creates problems, but also there's a deep source of joy and happiness by making sure you see your money do good.
Yeah, well, why rob yourself of that today? One of the things, you asked me about my story early on, and I was on this path of being a clinical psychologist where I would have, presumably helped a lot of people in a certain way. And hopefully I've helped other people in other ways with my chosen career path. But one of the things that I do with my family is every year we give a scholarship to a student in my doctoral program as a surprise, like right around Christmas, right? We work with a department, we call them up and we're like, hey, guess what? Your school, we've never met you before. We're the Crosby family and your school is free next year because we're going to take care of that for you. Because this was sort of the road not taken from me. And because I didn't take that road, I've had new opportunities, but I passed up other opportunities. And I believe in destigmatizing mental health. I believe in good mental health treatment. And like, that's the most incredible thing for me. That's the favorite money that I spend all year is writing that check to that program. In some senses, you could say I'm crazy. I still have 3 kids. Like I'm blessed, but I'm not independently wealthy. And I still have 3 kids I need to send to college. So in some sort of strict financial planning sense, it probably doesn't make sense. But like, why would I rob myself of that? Or why would I wait till I'm 70, to have that experience if I could have it today? So, don't deprive yourself of that happiness if you're in a position to give, even in small ways.
Absolutely. I think Morgan Housel said that, our personal financial decisions are made around the dinner table, not on a spreadsheet. And if we let the spreadsheet dictate it might not allow us to make those decisions, right? So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's truly transformational for those people that you give it to. And I bet they're thrilled that you're able to do that. Because I know education in America is a very expensive expensive commitment, right? So it's wonderful that you're doing that. Daniel, as we wrap up, I'd love to just, I'm asking everybody these three questions. I do love chocolate. We've talked about donuts. I do love chocolate. And I've tried to come up with a very clever phrase to ask these three questions. Now, I've called them the Toblerone of truth. So, yeah, that's my favourite chocolate bar. So these three questions are going to, I just want to get a sense of understanding from you, really. Firstly, what do you think your retirement will look like?
So my retirement, if I have my way, is going to be about pursuing my varied intellectual interests. One of the things that I like to do more than anything in the world is write books. And if I had my way, I would write a new book about a new topic every year. And writing books, unless you're Morgan Housel, doesn't pay very well. Morgan Housel's gotten paid quite nicely off of this book. But myself, I've not...
And a movie contract to boot as well, hasn't he?
Yeah, I've not made quite as much as Morgan. But, one of the things is I love writing. It's not especially remunerative. But I do enjoy the process of learning and testing my own assumptions. So I hope that my retirement is filled with family, long walks, and lots of writing and studying.
Sounds amazing and wonderful. Yeah, I love that. So I'm going to ask you to kind of become your dad, if that's all right. Mm-hmm. So you're a financial advisor. You're sitting in front of someone who's 55. And you've established that they've got enough money for the retirement that they desire. What would be your number one tip for a happy, healthy, and wealthy retirement?
So, if you want to go one tip for a happy and healthy retirement is the right people. Like when we look at the power of a tribe, the power of a friend group, the power of surrounding yourself with family and friends and people who love you, it's more predictive of longevity than things like obesity, smoking, exercise. Like, it's incredible. There are parts of the world, we're not going to name names. There's parts of the world that eat very poorly, smoke unfiltered cigarettes, but everyone gets together on the front porch every night and drinks wine and plays guitar and sings, and they live forever. And so, one of the keys, there's a real, I don't know how it is in Europe. There's a real epidemic of loneliness in the US. I imagine it's through much of the Western world. And I think surrounding yourself with the right people is one of the greatest life hacks and greatest secrets to longevity and quality, a long life and a good life.
That's pretty profound, that. I've not really kind of delved into that. And I absolutely understand and buy into that. I think there's research about tribes and how many people and that we feel comfortable with, which I think is which is really cool research to understand who you need to surround yourself with. So yeah, fantastic. So last question before we wrap up: when it comes to this human versus retirement face-off that we confront ourselves with, is there anything that I've not asked you that I should have done?
So, I didn't get into it, but I would point your listeners toward what's called the PERMA model. So PERMA. This is, I think, a great sort of intellectual scaffolding for thinking about how whole your life is, right? This is the development of Martin Seligman. He's sort of the father of positive psychology. He's the one that sort of shifted the rudder on psychology away from studying brokenness and pain and anxiety and sort of pointed us towards studying what makes people whole and happy. And the PERMA model, each of those letters, it's sort of an acrostic. Each of those letters stands for something different. And, folks can go check it out. Just rate yourself 1 to 10 on each of those 5 life dimensions. And I think you'll have a great sort of framework for thinking about your happiness now and well into retirement.
So I'll link that in the show notes. It's a model that I've looked at and familiar with. So I'll link that in the show notes. Daniel, I'll link the books in the show notes, and I strongly recommend that you go to your favorite online bookstore. There's only one that I know of, and download or buy those books. They are absolutely phenomenal. But Daniel, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom today. I really greatly appreciate it. Thank you for listening to the Humans versus Retirement podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with me today. Until next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to the Humans versus Retirement podcast. Subscribe to be notified when new episodes become available. We would love to have you along for the journey. If you like what you heard, then we would appreciate you taking a few minutes to leave us a review. And lastly, if you want to explore your retirement plans further, download our free 7-step retirement GPS toolkit linked in the show notes. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of TFP or Dan Haylett. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, so please always seek the advice of professionals with any questions you may have regarding your retirement.